let me just pick up your last strand, and then we'll all get talking about this stuff, and then we'll take as many questions as we can. Let's now assume there are going to be document dumps October 6th and 7th of 2020. And people in newsrooms, my newsroom, will have just, I will share what you've just said, and other newsrooms will hear about it as well. But in practical matter, what do we do? Is there something, let's say, radical we could do? Should a document dump be put into a kind of lockdown for a period of time where grown-up journalists can have at it? Panama Papers was a little that way. Remember Panama Papers? The huge document dump from a mysterious source came through Germany, but it didn't come out that second. Real journalists had some time to try to go through this complex stuff. Then those with access to it started doing their scoops. What do we actually do other than, yeah, good idea, let's try to do that?
If I could make one change, we've got to remember this is real time. We've got a presidential debate coming up. It's an election in which there's a lot that is happening that is ancillary to this as well. And you've got one party aggressively pushing one interpretation. I would stop the process at the point at which the AP reporter and the first print reporters and the first writers for anything that's going online, because we haven't gotten to network news yet, are beginning to file. And I'd say this is now our first story about this. Can we look at every single thing in there and apply every one of those standards, including let's go back to the text that we have? And are we sure that this is going to hold up a week from now, a month from now? Because we have the problem that if we find out we were wrong after the election, we've affected an outcome. And if there's any doubt, I would lock it up. And I would put the best people on it for the longest period of time. It's problematic when you have thousands and thousands of documents. But in this case, the press was narrowing into one block, and legitimately so, because Bernie Sanders had called for release of those speeches. There's a legitimate public interest in knowing what he said in those speeches. So you can say, of all the things that were dumped, that's where I'm going to concentrate my time. But if they'd applied that, it wouldn't have been taken out of context in the very first stories. Then the stories that simply cite back to those stories would not have been written because they would have been back into context. And all the way through, it wouldn't have gotten to the Sunday shows. It wouldn't have gotten into the debate. The reason I'm featuring the debate so heavily is 66+ million people, and that's just the direct audience, are exposed. Debates are extraordinarily powerful vehicles. And in that environment, and I didn't show you the rest for time, Hillary Clinton looks disingenuous when she responds to these two, because the presumption of the exchange is the journalist has accurately capsulized it, and she's dissembling. And she already has the perception problem that she is charitably put wary, but if you're adopting a Trump perspective, a hypocrite and a liar, in that framing, when she sounds disingenuous, it defaults into a schema that hurts her greatly.
And there's precedent for editors saying, no, this doesn't go to press yet. You're missing a piece. We have a question. I hope you're formulating your questions, but guess what? A satellite location has beat us to the punch. Portland, Maine. When governments attack journalists to suppress information, where's the line between the public's need to know and revealing classified information? Yeah, we fought that one over the years.
I think that's yours.
No. Nice try.
Valerie Plame, Pentagon Papers.
I have a lot of respect for the relationship that journalists on the intelligence beat, the relationship they have with the people who are inside the governmental structures. And if those are relationships that over time have been built and are trustworthy, so that these people have not been manipulating, and they say there's a legitimate national security concern, I believe it is appropriate for the journalists to take that seriously because they can trust the relationship. If there's any breach in that relationship, then my bias is toward disclosure. But I think there are cases in which it is highly problematic for something to come into public space, particularly if it endangers lives, where it's a difficult call, and I think that trusting that relationship is solid. And then if it's not, we've got a problem. Then we're in your situation where now you're actually making this call. But we've got plenty of instances in which major news organizations have not published at the request for what I think in retrospect were perfectly legitimate concerns. There are also instances in which they have not. In retrospect, you look back and say, wait a minute, they got conned, at which point the people who conned those journalists should never be trusted again. Now you go back to rule number one.
Can I ask you a question? It was a brilliant talk, Abe. And so I'm honored to be able to ask you a question. Newsworthiness.
Yeah.
I'm interested in that in a world of scarcity and abundance. Yeah. Right? The scarcity used to be our space and our time. Yeah. So what fit on the front page, right? That scarcity is completely gone now. Mm-hmm. So you can dump anything you want, everything you want. You can write hundreds of stories. The Hill will rewrite them all, and there you are, right? The scarcity now is the newsroom attention. So I like your test that you decide what to focus on. Mm-hmm. But does that make a difference in terms of how things are chosen? And then the second part of the question is, do you see evidence that there is self-examination in newsrooms of the sort that you are informing and suggesting and demanding?
Let me reframe a little bit on your first question. I think there is such a thing as consequential fact. Journalists have plenty of facts, and they have plenty of data. And the judgment that you make about newsworthiness should be in terms of the consequential nature of the information. And in election, the way I ask the consequential question is, if a voter believed this and got it wrong, would the voter vote differently? And if the answer is yes, that's really consequential. So you spend a lot of time making sure that, particularly when you've got a whole lot of dissonant information out there, that you have really aggressively worked to clarify. And let me take it out of politics for a moment. Right now, in the last year, we had a measles outbreak across the United States. It is inexcusable that we had a measles outbreak across the United States. This is something that we should not have any of. There should not be transmission of measles inside the United States, period. So we know what consequential facts affect people's decisions to vaccinate. When you're writing about vaccination, you want to make sure that you have handled those in a way that increases the likelihood that people understand that the risk-benefit relationship, the ratio, favors vaccination so overwhelmingly that although there are rare side effects, but they are rare, that net individually is toward vaccination, and collectively it is overwhelmingly toward vaccination. And so we just completed a study across the time when there's actually a measles outbreak ongoing. We took 4 of the common tropes that are spread that are misinformation about measles. So it's better to get natural immunity from measles than it is to get vaccination. Measles cause autism. There are toxins in the measles vaccine. So we've got 4 of them. We tracked them across a 5-month period in the middle of the measles outbreak. And we found, and this is for the person who said, can you give us good news? Those who across that 5-month period were traditional news media reliant were less likely to hold them at second time than in the first time. Those who were social media reliant across that time were more likely to hold misinformation. Now, what does that say?
Can I insert something right here?
Yeah.
The Maine paper this morning I picked up in the lobby, somebody caught me reading an old paper, has a story about the Maine, you guys all know more about this than I do. What's that again? No on One, which is a ballot initiative, right?
Yeah.
And the coverage before the jump on the front page is, well, there's this side and there's that side.
Yep.
And so we get caught in that balance thing where you don't come out of that page 1 coverage with a clear sense of that, just to throw it a little newsy ankle.
Well, and that's actually where this argument goes. Yep. It says, if you know what the consequential fact is, and you know there is a scientific consensus, and you know that there's a private good and a public good, you may not ethically, as a journalist, engage in equivalence framing.
Amen.
So, and to your second question, I've been on this tear about the journalists and hacked content from the time the book came out. Because I think that this is something that's really tangible and clear with people for whom I have an enormous amount of respect. Whom I think wake up in the morning and work really hard to do the best job that they can under very difficult circumstances. And for about the first year and a half, I think the entire enterprise was in denial. Basically, oh yeah, the Russians did stuff, and they're pointing at the platforms. The troll content on the platforms is highly unlikely to have influenced the outcome. It had an effect on the margin. The effect is this. It's a news effect. So for the first year and a half, I was really concerned. Because if you think that's where the effect was, and they think somebody else is the problem, well, it's fine. Focus on the platforms. Get the platforms to fix all the things that need fixing. I support all of that, but please clean your own house up in the process. Then, someplace about a year and a half in, it started to change. And I think it started to change because people in the journalistic community started to write pieces. There was a lovely piece in Columbia Journalism Review, which is highly self-reflective, and went to the editors and asked them questions. And it started to elicit answers that suggested more self-awareness. Now, these teams early had made statements, but that was everything I had at the point at which the book went to press. That was it. Those were all 3 statements, nothing else. So I think there now is a higher level of self-awareness. The question is, what changes have they made in the newsroom? And I don't expect them to stand up and tell everybody, but I hope that they have. Anybody who's a journalist, please go back to your journalistic operation and ask, have you? What would we do differently? And then let me know.
You know, a journalist comes into the newsroom and offers a false equivalence analysis of vaccination, they get in trouble. But a journalist writes a piece about the ballot measure in which the other side is not properly evoked. That's also a problem. It gets complicated, especially when it's cast as a binary choice on a ballot.
But if our primary job is to inform the electorate with known facts, then if we see ourselves not as a content-filling machine, but instead as a service to the public, and we ask, what is that service? If that service is to truly inform people, then it has to affect that false balance crap.
But there's one more thing that's problematic, and it has been, I'm an elderly woman. Said it twice, I'll say it 5 times. Elderly woman, which means I've been doing this for a very long time. We've been looking at the tactical framing in journalism going back into the 1970s. The tendency to focus on horse race, on appearance, on who's ahead in the polls and why. The assumption is if you're ahead, you must be doing things well. If not, well, there must be something wrong with you. Money is a surrogate for popularity, et cetera. We actually did a study of this that is the biggest, most expensive study I ever did. We created a controlled experiment, an actual field experiment. We reran the Philadelphia mayoral election across the country in different media markets. We exposed people to the actual coverage in our race, which was tactical. Who's ahead, who's behind, they're just pandering to this constituency, that constituency. In the middle of those stories, there was issue information. This candidate with this. It's not that they're issue free, it's that it's framed in a tactical frame. So we went to our local ABC affiliate, the #1 in the market. We went to the local paper, Philadelphia Inquirer. We got the same reporters to rewrite the stories from a problem-solution frame. Here's the problem addressing the community. Here are the alternative positions. And we had literally the people at WPVI, whom I will love forever for doing this, put on the same suits with the same ties, stood against the same background. At one point, one of the journalists stood in front of a tree and said, "But Kathleen, the leaves are different." And I said, "You get confounding variables." And they helped us rewrite the scripts. So unlike academics who could not write to save our lives, they basically moved it into journalistically acceptable words. Thank you, Kit Seeley of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and now of the New York Times and the Boston Bureau. Now we're out in the field, and we take people who know nothing of our mayoral election. For 5 days, we give them a half hour of local news, embedding in one condition our tactical coverage, the other condition our problem solution coverage. The morning of that day, they're given a front page that has our tactical coverage or our solution coverage. So literally for 5 days, we're mimicking an election for them. You think this wasn't expensive? This was over $1 million. So those of you looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, privately funded. Now here's what happened. And there are conditions in between where you get tactics in print, problem solution in broadcast, and vice versa. But let me just talk about the extremes. Those who had the tactical coverage in print as well as in broadcast across a 5-day period are at the end of that period, the tactical coverage, less likely to remember any of the issue content that is in both of the conditions. Then we take a debate, an actual debate that our mayoral candidates engaged in, and we edited out all the tactical and strategic questions, thereby minimizing the amount of content that we had in order to put in the debate, and we showed them the clips of the debate, and we tested what they learned out of the debate. These are new issues. Those in the tactical condition did not learn the issue coverage in the actual debate, issue framed at the same level. So what did we say in this book called Spiral of Cynicism, written with Joe Capella, which you don't want to read? It is written for academics. What this tactical frame does is activate cynicism and depresses learning. Because it had 2 effects, not one. It depressed learning, but it activated cynicism. And the cynicism is activated like this. They said, well, whoever's elected, they're not going to keep their promises. And you think about the tactical frame, why should they? Everything about what they were doing with those issues was pandering to some constituency, right? So they became cynical. Now, some people, when we first published this, said, but that's realism. They don't keep their promises, so you've misanalyzed your data. That was the election that elected Ed Rendell. Ed Rendell became a 2-term mayor and then became governor, and he kept the majority of his promises. So we had a test in the real world of whether the cynical interpretation was legitimate or not. It wasn't. So what happened on that the Sunday news shows where I just showed you these little excerpts? The dominant frame was a tactical frame. Hillary Clinton thrown onto the ropes by release of the speech text she'd kept. What is your candidate going to? Donald Trump. Was it locker room bad, or is his campaign over? As opposed to looking into the substance. If you could just strip that away from those shows, remember, I'm believing that's activating citizen depressing learning, and then put in place a careful discussion about how they differ on trade, how they differ on banks, how they differ on borders. We might actually have gone into the debate with an electorate armed with a story-based, frame-based, fact-based interpretation of reality that would not be subject to misstatement of factual information.
Amazing. Question from the balcony here in Camden. Tell us your name and where you're from. Hi.
Hi, I'm Christina Cloutier. I'm from Bucksport, Maine, here with UMF. My question is, do you believe that journalists are being educated to check hacked material? And a second part of that, we talked a little bit about possibly licensing journalists. So do you believe that that would help with that, knowing that they know how to use this material that they're getting from hackers?
So are we getting new skills to address some of your commands, either of you?
Yes, never enough.
Yeah.
I mean, we also teach security now, which is part of the awareness that people are going to come after both you and information. But I think it's an excellent question, because I don't know if we're doing enough into that analytical question. We are teaching fact-checking, God bless us all. We're teaching verification, which is a whole new skill now with new jobs.
Really
but this is kind of analysis that doesn't exist. And to your second thing, I'm glad you raised it, because I want to say no! No to certifying journalists, no! Because what's given can be taken away.
Yeah.
And what's given officially can be taken away by the officials. And what's given by the industry will not be given to insurgents. So, the marketplace of ideas, sorry, but I still believe in it. And you're going to judge which sources. We need better systems to get you to better sources. We need better systems to make judgments. We need to get the platforms to stop being allergic to judgment and decide who's good in journalism and who's not. And it ain't Breitbart. God damn it. But no, I don't want to certify anybody. I don't want to wear your stinking badges.
The White House press corps is accredited by the White House, and they keep getting decertified by the White House because they don't like the questions being asked.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I was asked a question by the New York Times a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, that elicited a surprising, for me at least, surprising amount of controversy. The question was about a video that was edited to make it look as if Nancy Pelosi was tearing up a speech when she wasn't. And yeah, we and the other fact checkers went after it, et cetera. But the question was in the context of, shouldn't the platforms be required to take down things like that? And I said, look, our system doesn't trust government or corporations to get in the way of candidate speech.
Great stuff.
And the piece that I wish had gotten in, because when you talk to your reporter, you really try to say, I want you to hear this piece, is we know some things about history. One of the reasons we have rules in broadcast, and I think the internet should be standardized on its advertising rules against the broadcast, by the way, in terms of disclosure and required tagging, et cetera. But one of the things we know from history is that one of the reasons we have access provisions inside the broadcast code is that in the early days of radio, the station owners would say to a candidate, I don't like your views, you don't get your ads on. So we have actually institutionalized access to the electorate to candidate speech. Well, I don't trust those same station owners who didn't want somebody's views on to not say, okay, we're going to take your views, but you've got to edit this out and this out and this out, and I'm going to do this. I just fundamentally want to let the speech alone and create such a robust process that the process takes down and flags the deceptions. And I like the process online by which the fact checking gets fielded up screen right against when you're searching out something they know is problematic, has been flagged as problematic. I would like to see more signaling to the correction before you read the deception. Because if you can get the corrective context in place before you read the deception, you're more likely not to be influenced by the deception, because the memory trace you're laying down is the corrective one, not the deceptive one. They should reverse the order, because in this culture we read this way, not that way.
Just a tiny clarification. The video misrepresented Pelosi tearing up the speech?
Yeah, it showed her basically it was either tearing up the speech or not, and not applauding. I think it was tearing up the speech after the various heroes were standing up, as opposed to the very end of the Trump speech. So it looked as if throughout. Now that's deceptive, and the Trump folks were arguing that, well, obviously it's a parody. I mean, obviously we're just trying to make a larger point. I don't want to even get in the middle of that discussion. I want the fact checkers to say, this is where it happened. See, it's right there. Here she's applauding them. See, she's applauding them. And then let people say, oh, I was deceived by that because there she's applauding them. And remember when they watched the speech, oh yeah, I saw applauding, except for Rush Limbaugh. She did not applaud Rush Limbaugh, which the fact, we said, yep, she didn't applaud Rush Limbaugh. That would have been news had she.
Yeah. There's a question here. Tell us your name.
Hi, Diane Lebson, Camden, Maine. Is there any way that Hillary Clinton could have positively reframed her message following the WikiLeaks dump?
I'd try not to give advice to candidates, first because I'm abysmal at it, but secondly because I really believe you need to stay in a role consistently across time for your own well-being. So my perspective is, as best I can, to not think from the perspective of the candidate, but think from the perspective of the electorate. I wanted, as an electorate, to see those speeches that Bernie Sanders wanted to see, particularly if they were speeches to banks. Now, the fact that these weren't speeches to U.S. banks and were alleged to be, that's problematic, because that's a completely different context for the speech. But as an electorate, I would like to see her have given that content out during the primaries. The press have vetted the heck out of it. I mean, look at every single thing that's potentially discrepant. At which point, now I'm coming to your frame, her candidacy, I believe, would have weathered and benefited. It wouldn't have been good for her because she's giving the speeches and there's a large dollar amount of money attached to them. Her vulnerability wasn't in the content of the speeches. It turned out to be benign. It's that refeatured $225,000 for, that must have been one heck of a speech. And then you read the speech and you say, it didn't stand up well against Demosthenes. So.
Got a question up here in the balcony here in Camden.
Hi, Kevin from Camden, Maine, and I'm outing my bias right here. It's right on my shirt.
What does it say for those of us who can't see it?
Bernie Sanders, 2020.
All right.
So this is just moving us into.
How are you feeling this morning?
Very good. So I'm moving us into real-time headlines. So this is from 2 days ago from the New York Times, and this is the headline. Russia is said to be interfering to aid Sanders in Democratic primaries. And the Wall Street Journal ran a similar article, and CNN also, all days before the really important Nevada primary. And I went digging around this morning really hard to see the sources and more information about it, and all I could find is intelligence sources say, and then there was some mention of maybe bots. To me, this seems like a very vague piece of news. I mean, even the headline claimed to be helping. How can we, what can I do as a supporter to try and find out information? What's the responsibility of all of us to investigate this or hold them accountable for who the sources are, and is there a bias?
One note, I mean, because I actually have the New York Times article in front of me. Bernie Sanders doesn't dispute that story. He said he had been briefed a month earlier on these issues. Yeah, so it's not like he said this came out of nowhere, I don't know what they're talking about. I just wanted that to be clear. So in answer to his question?
That's you.
Yeah, I mean, we know from the Mueller investigation from the sources that they accessed inside St. Petersburg that the Russian messaging said, we favor Sanders, we favor Trump. So we know that from those sources. Then the question is, do you trust those sources then, and are they the same sources now? And one of the challenges that reporters faced as they were covering the various disclosures in 2016 is the intelligence sources were giving them conclusions without giving them evidence. And so you saw reporters being legitimately skeptical because intelligence agencies have gotten things wrong, weapons of mass destruction being a notable one. And so when someone says, this goes back to you, do you trust the source? Has the source been consistently reliable? when you have to make a trust-based inference. So when the intelligence services are constrained because they can't give us sources and methods. I mean, if they've got some way to know what's happening inside the troll cave in St. Petersburg, they're not going to tell Russia we've got that source in order to legitimize the inference to reporters. And so there's this gray area in which if the trustworthiness of those sources is called into question, as it is now routinely on one side or the other, it becomes harder in those circumstances because ordinarily you'd say, let's look to the evidence. So you notice my move is to say, I can tell you what the Mueller report said, the Russian messages said, and I can tell you, since we have 7 different confirmations by people who are appointed by Trump that they trust that evidence chain, that I believe that then. If these are the same people now, I'm willing to believe that now. I'd like to know enough to know who is doing that, in what agencies, in how great number, with what level of confidence, since the documents ultimately do say we have some level of confidence, and then they grade the confidence.
Can I ask you a question here? Just,
Go ahead.
you mentioned the word story a fair amount, and I think my latest heresy is to question our dependence upon the story.
Yeah.
I don't mean the article, I mean
Good
a
point.
story.
Good point.
So that the story here in the Bernie case is, oh, here we go again, we know that story, right? Or the story is, he knew what he didn't tell us. Or the story is, there's this effort to put the narrative frame.
Yeah.
And you did an incredibly elegant and eloquent job of saying the need to have that button and that frame, that story, that narrative. But there's also the seduction of the story that puts us into a groove and a rut and makes us want elements of drama.
Yeah.
What do we do about the impact of the story on all of us?
Yeah, and we know we have it. I mean, we know that we all have a coherence bias. So we have closure bias, and we will narrativize just about anything. So there was a study that was done in the 1950s in which people just put random shapes up on a screen, and they asked students what had they seen, and they created a story. The triangle doesn't like the square, but actually likes the circle, and as a result, they have offsprings which are rectangles. It was really, just really bizarre. So we know there's a really strong human drive. And one of the things that we can say about what happened in the 2016 election is the Sanders-Clinton narrative about disclosure of the Clinton speech is a narrative in which the press assumes that the public has a right to have access to this information. The premise built into this is we're not asking for something that is an illegitimate request here. So then now this hacked content comes up. Did that narrative structure, was it so strong that it led to an uncritical assumption that what was there was problematic when it didn't turn out to be? So I think being aware of what our narratives are and our narrative biases is really important. And from the perspective of a Sanders supporter, you read this and say, what? The Russians want to elect my candidate? I will posit, based on just intuition, they don't want to see Bernie Sanders as president. That would be just my guess. So, I mean, the danger in those narrative frames is people draw the wrong assumption, which is Putin would have a party and say, wow, this is fantastic. Bernie Sanders is president of the United States, and Donald Trump no longer is. And now we have Trump Tower in Moscow.
Somebody was first in the back. Zach, you had somebody, and then we'll try to get up here. Quick question, running out of time, but then there's an enormous Q&A period after a break. But tell us your name.
Denise Munger, Rockport, and it's a follow-on with the coming from a different perspective on the Bernie Sanders information, and I wondered how journalists should handle information like that, because and I understand that the timing's problematic, but I want to know more about it. I want to understand better why the Russians are going after, or why they've, are hacking the Democratic primaries to support Bernie Sanders. And I wonder, I think you've already alluded to some of that, but how should journalists handle something that has such potential to affect our elections?
I think we're just looking at the journalist.
Yeah, when I'm writing the book about this is what I will try to answer for you. And maybe the Russians are just trying to make it look like they're supporting Bernie Sanders, for there to be this equivalency. It's the other issue is we also don't have we can't just open a box and find out what the truth is and then tell you. We have intelligence agencies who are working on this. It's absolutely an assignable story. Zach, come to the front. There's some more questions up here. Here comes the microphone. This patient set of people.
And while you're doing that, by the way, given what we know about how the trolls behave, I wouldn't put it past trolls, regardless of national origin, trying to make a candidate's supporters look bad by pretending to be them and engage in untoward behavior. Untoward not being a troll word.
Jim Matlack from Camden. I think both the media and the electorate have an enormous challenge in this cycle because we have a president who lies relentlessly, daily, insistently. Is there any hope? I mean, my phrase for him is he's a walking megaphone of mendacity. Is there any hope that the media will gain a better capacity to fact-check him in real time?
You're the fact check, Bob Arden.
One of the challenges in an environment in which there are many, many statements that are problematic is which ones do you spend your time on? And it's the reason for saying consequential deceptions need to get more priority. We need to think harder about how you engage them effectively with audiences to build structures of understanding, not simply a capacity to rebut some individual instance. And I think one of the difficulties, and I have great respect for what the Washington Post is doing, trying to keep track of problematic statements by the president and other leaders, but it makes it look as if each one of those statements is equally problematic. And there are statements in which someone gets something wrong by 0.5%, but the direction of the claim is correct. The direction of the claim is correct. When they're saying something's up, it's up. They're saying it's up a little bit more than it is. That's really different than saying X is Y, if it's something that voters care about. And I think one of the problems the fact-checking community has, because in order to ensure that we are not engaging in any form of bias, we tend to check it all. And that's a protection against bias. But in the process of checking it all, a sample of the whole, we check every single ad. We check every single claim in every debate. How do I know I'm not engaging in selective bias? We look at every single sentence. We have people of opposite ideology read against the person who wrote the fact check, and then I counter-argue them all. So we put all those protections in place. One protection is we're looking at them all. But we list all of it, and you say, what of that matters to people? And should we have spent a whole lot more time on the 2 or 3 big things that, if you get them wrong, really do affect votes and your understanding and affect their capacity to govern? I think that's our biggest problem right now, is we haven't figured out how to do that.
And it doesn't even need the news media to transmit the tweet. The tweet gets out anyway. And that's, so we have decisions in the morning about not covering every single tweet that comes out of there. But on the other hand, they're out there and it's already being spread. Quick last question from here, and then we're going to go to this break because people are getting ready for a break.
Okay. Paul Velleman, Camden. Is there any hope that the fact checkers, factcheck.org or others, could help tell us who the reliable purveyors of news are? I mean, I know about the Times and the Post and the Wall Street Journal, but I don't know about many of the other sources that might, in fact, be reliable. Should you be doing some retroactive checking and grading of news sources so that we know where the trustworthy news sources are?
I think what we ought to do and hope to do is create a list of the unreliable. So if you could just simply say, I read this in the Denver Guardian, go here, type in Denver Guardian, that would be very helpful. And the question, because after the election, those were compiled. The question is, could we be smart about finding them in real time and heading it off? And could we say that when someone begins to traffic that out in cyberspace, it comes through the fact-checking structure, preferably not to the right, to the left, preferably more visible than it is, but nonetheless, it gives you a flag to say, we don't think they exist. Long before you're able to say who they actually are, you can say real or unreal.
The issue, obviously, is they're way ahead of us. And so I was involved in a lot of efforts on misinformation to compile these lists, and the lists are immediately, of the bad guys, are obsolete. And on the good side, I think that's where I want to concentrate as well, in a few ways. I mean, keeping us honest as journalism, the challenge that Kathleen made to my profession, to our profession, is so critical. And we tend to give each other a lot of awards because we sprayed ourselves, patting ourselves on the back. And I've joked that we almost need a reverse Pulitzer. We need a national ombuds structure where you can go and have the debates about but who emailed New York Times. And you can have that with the New York Times. And you can make ourselves better. And I don't think we do nearly enough of that. And then the next problem is that the platforms, as I mentioned earlier, are allergic to judgments. So I'm working on a project, full disclosure, funded by Facebook and probably the other platforms, very small, to convene some journalism professors and journalists and engineers to try to come up with workable definitions of quality in news that the platforms can then use as they scrape news content. So we also give them cover, I would hope, for having the guts to not include Breitbart in a news tab just because they need that many from the right.
Do you remember Professor Tucker yesterday? Josh Tucker was talking about the study that kept coming up a lot about older people and maybe more prone to sharing fake news. Remember what his definition of fake news was? He said something really quick about BuzzFeed and a reporter at BuzzFeed. So you can find Josh's list of the fake news sites. I happened to bring it with me thinking you might ask.
I just happened to have
how about this one? Number 2 is abcnews.com.co. AmericanMilitaryNews.com. TMZ you've heard of, but TMZHipHop.com. So it's interesting, and that's just, a diligent journalist at BuzzFeed started a list. Dr. Tucker's lab used it,
Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed. Follow him, and you will get a lot of good reporting on this.
Tell his name again?
Craig Silverman.
Craig Silverman. Let's get a break. I'm moving the reconvening time ahead by 5 minutes. We have to be in our seats and rocking and rolling at 10:30. Kathleen Hall Jamieson signing her books. Jason Rezaian, that amazing book about 544 days, also signing. It'd be awesome to have copies of that and to talk to them directly. Thank you.